Hello, listener. The fact you hear this means you're alive. If you're new here, consider subscribing and comment below where you're listening from. Let's begin the story. My name is Harlan Corbett. Winter has always made more sense to me than summer. Summer feels soft, cluttered with crowds and easy trails. The cold strips a mountain down to its bones. No tourists, no noise, just ice, granite, and wind. That kind of brutality is honest. It kept pulling me back up to the high country while everyone else was busy putting their gear into heated storage. I pay the bills doing rope access work, hanging off bridge pilings and cell towers, fixing rusted bolts that most people never even know exist. Climbing started as training for the paycheck, but it turned into the only place my head ever truly quiets down. Up on a wall, you don't argue with anybody. An anchor holds, or it fails. A knot is tied right, or you take the ride. The feedback loop is immediate, and you only get one chance to be wrong. Friends used to ask why I solo in winter. I never had an answer that sounded smart enough for them. Part of it is purely economic. Partners bail, guides are expensive, and a tank of gas is cheaper than a therapist. But mostly it's about control. When it's just you and the route, there's no committee to vote on the next move. You pick the line, you pack the haul bag, and you own the consequences if you misjudge the weather. The last climb before the world broke was supposed to be a routine lap. It was a clean north face I'd tagged twice before. The forecast promised clear skies and dry rock, with wind building later, but nothing unexpected. I packed light, fast and loose. I threw in my cliff tent, a hanging shelter designed for vertical walls, more out of habit than necessity, along with a single gas canister and a compact heater. I hate shivering through emergency bivouacs if I get stuck. The plan was surgical. Tag the summit, descend to the trailhead by dark, and be home before the highway glazed over. That was the plan anyway, back when plans still meant something. By the time I finally topped out, the sun was nothing more than a pale, sickly disk buried behind a layer of thin cirrus clouds. The wind had picked up, shifting from a breeze to a steady, biting gale that found every gap in my layers. I didn't linger. I tagged the summit cairn with a gloved hand, took one fast, uninterested look at the empty ridgeline stretching out to the north, and turned straight into the descent. It wasn't a day for soaking in the view. The mountain felt restless, like the barometric pressure was dropping too fast, and my gut told me to get off the exposed rock. The snow conditions were deteriorating. Up high, on the windward side, the surface was scoured hard, wind-packed slab that my crampons barely bit into. Further down, it broke into a thin, treacherous, breakable crust. Each step sent a dull, vibrating crunch up through my boots and into my shins. It was the kind of snow that tears ACLs if you get lazy. I kept the pace steady, finding a rhythm, step, breathe, check, step, just eating vertical meters while there was still usable light. The route back to the trailhead was straightforward enough. It wound down a north-facing couloir, narrow and steep, then cut across a wide, open shoulder that offered a panoramic view over the valley floor and the interstate highway. Halfway down the couloir, just as I was navigating a patch of mixed rock and ice, my phone buzzed against my chest. I keep it in the inner pocket of my shell to save the battery, close to body heat. Service on this face was basically a myth, so the vibration felt like an intrusion. It dug straight into my nerves, breaking my focus. I stopped on a small sloping stance, kicked my front points into brace, and pulled the phone out with stiff, clumsy fingers. A single notification sat waiting. A video clip from a friend in town sent with no context, just the line, "You seeing this?" The signal was garbage, one bar, flickering in and out. I hit play and got half a second of smeared, pixelated video before it stalled. The audio came through first, a siren wailing in the background, distorted and tinny, followed by someone yelling something raw and panicked that I couldn't make out. Then the screen froze on a blur of motion, and the loading wheel started to spin. I stood there, perched on the side of a frozen gully, watching that little circle turn. Cold crept into my gloves while I waited, numbing my fingertips. Nothing else came through. The app crashed, and the screen went black. A second later, a system alert popped up. One of those generic bold-font government banners about staying home, avoiding public spaces, and minimizing travel. I rolled my eyes. Those warnings roll across phones a few times a year now. Fire season, flash floods, or some civil unrest somewhere 3 states away. It barely registered as a threat. I killed the screen, shoved the phone back into the warmth of my pocket, and checked my anchors. Up here, the world still felt logical. Ice was ice, rock was rock, and gravity did exactly what it always does. Politics and panic didn't work at 8,000 feet. Everything changed when the angle eased off and the tree line started to reclaim the slope. I came out of the narrow channel onto the broad shoulder and finally had a clear, unobstructed view down the valley. From that height, you can usually trace the highway as a thin gray ribbon, with the occasional semi-truck or sedan sliding along it like a toy. What caught my eye first wasn't movement, but the total lack of it. The strip of asphalt looked wrong. Even from up high, it looked jammed. I squinted against the glare off the snow, trying to make sense of the geometry. I shaded my eyes with a hand and let them adjust to the distance. The pattern came into focus and my stomach tightened. Cars sat nose to tail in both lanes, gridlocked. Some were half on the shoulder, pushed into the ditch. One was sideways across both lanes near the exit ramp that led toward the recreation area. No plows were working, no flashing lights from cruisers, no slow, steady flow of traffic. Just a parking lot of dead metal. A smear of dark, oily smoke hung over the cloverleaf interchange. I pulled out the small, compact binoculars I keep clipped to my harness for scouting routes and steadied my elbows on my knees to kill the shake. Through the glass, the highway snapped closer, revealing details I didn't want to see. Doors hung open on a dozen vehicles. One SUV had both rear doors flung wide, like the passengers had bailed out in a blind panic. A massive semi-truck sat jackknifed near the overpass, the trailer blocking the entire southbound side. And there were no people. No one walked along the shoulders. No one stood by their cars on their phones. It was a ghost town made of steel. Off to the right, just beyond the blocked exit ramp, lay the strip of land the town had tried to rebrand as an adventure park. Zip lines, high ropes courses, a few climbing walls bolted into old quarry cuts. I knew the place. I'd helped load test some of the anchor bolts when they first opened a few years back. From where I stood, I could see one of the long zip lines stretched across a deep ravine, the steel cable catching the flat afternoon light, the wooden platforms tucked into the pines at either end. There should have been color down there. Bright helmets, neon jackets, the flash of harnesses. Instead, the place sat still. The flags at the entry gate hung limp in the dead air. The main lodge looked dark, windows black and lifeless. A few vehicles were scattered in the gravel lot, but they weren't parked in neat rows. They looked abandoned, left mid-turn or rolled into snowbanks. At first, I tried to rationalize it. I told myself it was a winter weekday. Business was slow. Maybe there was a power outage. Then a flash of movement near the far side of the lot pulled my eye. One figure broke cover, running between 2 parked cars. It was a full sprint, aggressive and desperate, shoulders hunched low. A second shape followed a few seconds later, moving faster than the first. Binoculars are useless when your hands are shaking from adrenaline or cold. I forced my breathing down, rested the barrel of the optics against a granite boulder, and tracked them. The leading figure stumbled, hit the pavement hard, and scrambled back up without looking back. The second figure did not slow down. It closed the gap with a speed that didn't make sense. My brain tried to file it wrong for a heartbeat, maybe a dog, maybe a trick of the light, because human bodies don't move with that kind of fluid, mechanical violence. Then they vanished behind a row of parked cars and did not reappear. I lowered the glasses. The silence of the mountain suddenly felt heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. My phone buzzed once more against my ribs, then lost signal again. I pulled it out. A headline had half loaded on the screen, fragmented words about a fast-acting fever and widespread civil unrest, and then the data cut out. None of it felt specific enough to my life to make me stop moving. I was still just a guy on a mountain miles from the mess. I finished crossing the open slope and dropped back into the trees, angling toward the lower switchbacks that would spit me out near the trailhead and the gravel lot where I had left my truck. The forest was darker than the ridge. Branches creaked overhead as the wind picked up, groaning like old wood in a ship. No fresh tracks cut across the path but mine and a few old deer prints that had frozen over. I told myself it would sort out by the time I reached the bottom. Maybe a pileup on the highway, maybe a chemical spill, maybe some protest that turned stupid and blocked the road. My truck was down there. My keys were in my pocket. With nothing better to go on, I kept descending one step and then the next, aiming for a trailhead I still desperately believed would be waiting for me exactly how I left it. The final stretch to the trailhead should have been a victory lap. The path dropped in wide, lazy switchbacks through the pine forest, eventually dumping out at the gravel lot by the recreation park and the access road that led back to civilization. I still had daylight on my side. My hands were warm enough to work a set of keys, and my plan was beautifully simple. Get down, get in the truck, crank the heat, and go home. About 15 minutes above the lot, the forest canopy broke open. A short, beaten side track led to a rock outcrop that tourists used for selfies in the summer. I stepped onto the granite slab and finally got a look at the ground I had been walking toward all day. My truck sat exactly where I had left it in the far corner of the lot, a familiar shape in the fading light. That was the only normal thing down there. 3 other vehicles were scattered at angles that made my brain itch. A sedan was nose-deep in a snowdrift with a rear door hanging open like a broken wing. A pickup truck sat sideways, straddling 2 parking spots, the driver's door flung wide. A dark cargo van near the park gate was stopped dead across the exit lane like someone had let it roll in neutral and never bothered to correct the wheel. There was no movement between them. The main lodge and the ticket booth were dark. On a winter weekday, you still expect signs of life. A light in the admin office, a staff truck with the engine running, a plow idling near the shed. Here there was nothing, just static shapes and snow. A sudden flash of movement near the van snapped my eyes back to the scene. A man staggered into view, bent over at the waist, hands braced on his knees. His jacket hung open, flapping in the wind, and I could see one sleeve was empty, the fabric torn. He straightened up, looked back toward the highway with a jerk of his head and tried to run. His legs carried him maybe 5 steps before his boots lost traction on the ice and he went down hard. Something else exploded from the gap between 2 cars farther back. At first, my brain read it as another person sprinting. Same forward lean, same arm swing. Then the distance closed too fast. This second figure didn't run. It ate the frozen lot. It moved like it had spikes bolted to its feet. I ripped the small binoculars from my harness, jammed them against my eyes, and found the focus. The head was bare, no hat, no hood. The skin was pale, drawn tight over the skull. The mouth hung open as it ran, not gasping for air, just open, a black void. Every stride hit clean on the ice and ruts. No flinch, no hesitation, no slip. It was mechanical efficiency wrapped in human skin. It hit the fallen man without slowing down. There was no shout, no warning, just the kinetic thud of impact. Both bodies slammed into the side of the sedan, denting the metal. The pale one came up on top instantly, pinning the man, and its shoulders started to jerk in a short, fast, violent rhythm that didn't look like any kind of first aid I'd ever seen. My stomach dropped. My truck sat maybe 20 yards from that van. The only road out ran right past them. There was no version of this scenario where I walked calmly to my door, unlocked it, and drove away without that thing noticing. I lowered the glasses. My heart was hammering against my ribs now. The ridge trail didn't offer many friendly options. Backtracking up the couloir in fading light would burn hours I didn't have and put me on steep technical ground while I was tired and rattled. The only other route off this side of the mountain without a full retreat was through the adventure park itself. A narrow maintenance path cut from the overlook down to the upper launch tower. From there, a service road snaked behind the ropes course and tied into a different logging spur miles down the valley. On a normal day, that path was a scenic detour. Today, it was the only line that didn't run me straight through the kill zone in the parking lot. I holstered the binoculars, tightened the hip belt on my pack to lock the load down, and took the maintenance trail. It dropped fast through tight trees, the trail half buried under wind-blown snow. My trekking poles bit through the crust and my boots found roots and rock under the white. I moved fast, trading silence for speed. The upper tower came into view as the trees opened up. It was a beast of a structure. 3 levels of pressure-treated wood and galvanized steel standing on a concrete pad at the lip of a deep, shadowed ravine. The long zipline stretched out from the top deck, the thick steel cable humming in the wind, disappearing into empty air before reaching the far platform hidden in the trees across the gap. I walked to the edge of the concrete pad and looked down. The ravine dropped away steep and hard. Dark rock, scrub brush, and a lot of gravity. It was a long way to the bottom, 100 meters at least. From here, the height and the cable stopped being tourist attractions. Together, they were a path that never touched the ground. The rest of the scene at the tower base was wrong. The chain-link entry gate stood wide open, the padlock hanging off a cut hasp. The rental room door on the lower level hung ajar, swinging slightly in the draft. Helmets lay scattered in the snow near the stairs like discarded shells. Boot prints marked the wooden steps going up, pressed deep, some smeared with mud or something darker. None came back down. I briefly thought about skipping the tower and taking the service road anyway, cutting behind the park and hoping to pop out far enough from the lot that whatever was down there wouldn't see me. I had just started moving along the base of the structure when something hit the tower legs from below. It hit hard enough that I felt the vibration travel through the frozen ground and into my boots. The first impact came from the direction of the maintenance lane I had just come down. A second impact followed a heartbeat later, heavy, rhythmic thuds. Snow shook loose from the lower cross-bracing. I stepped to the corner of the tower and leaned out just enough to see downslope. One figure was sprinting up the same trail I had used, bare scalp, pale skin, that same impossible speed. It moved like it had been built for that steep angle. Head down, arms loose at the sides, feet hitting so clean that each step sounded like a hammer striking frozen ground. It wasn't winding itself, it wasn't slowing, it was hunting. I did the math instantly. I had maybe 10 seconds before it broke into the clearing. On flat snow, fresh and rested, I might have tried to outrun it and dive for the dense trees. But after a full day on a winter route with a 40-pound pack on my back, that would just get me caught in the open. I'd be dead before I hit the tree line. The tower and the line overhead gave me one more option. I knew how they were built. I had helped test the anchor plates after the install. The tower end was overbuilt steel. The far end was bolted into solid bedrock. The cable was static steel rated for loads way above a single rider. If the anchors held and I didn't screw up the rigging, that line could put real distance and a deep, impassable hole between us. I carry a compact pulley for rescue work, a microtraxion, a steel wheel with side plates, clipped to my harness and wrapped with tape to keep it from icing up. My hand found it before the thought even finished. Below, the footfalls grew louder, closer, a steady, terrifying hammering on the trail. I hit the stairs. I took them 2 at a time, lungs burning, boots thudding on the wood. The sound of my own ascent felt deafening. I didn't look back. I hit the first landing, spun, and kept climbing. The top deck was empty. The guest trolley, the big, safe, idiot-proof carriage they use for tourists, hung parked on a short safety chain at the side of the cable, locked out of the way with a heavy padlock I couldn't break. I didn't need it. I clipped my adjustable lanyard to the safety rail, stepped to the edge where the cable left the tower, and looked out over the ravine. One narrow steel line stretched out in front of me. The impact at the base of the tower shook the deck under my boots. The whole structure groaned. There was no time left for better plans. The thing was at the bottom of the stairs. There was no time left for better plans. I ripped the pulley off my harness gear loop, flipped the side plates open with my thumb, and jammed the steel wheel over the cable. Below me, something hit the lower cross braces hard enough to send a vibration shuddering all the way up the tower legs. I clipped my main adjustable lanyard into the pulley, backed it up with a second locking carabiner through my belay loop, and checked both gates by feel. Screw locked down, gate closed. Then I unhooked my safety tether from the tower rail. I swung one leg over the gap, then the other, until I was hanging with just the tips of my boots on the edge of the wooden platform. From that angle, I could see the thing that had chased me. It hit the clearing at a full sprint, bare scalp shining in the flat light, mouth hanging open, eyes locked on the exact point where my trail ended. The body was human, but the way it moved showed zero regard for self-preservation. It didn't slow down for the terrain, it just hammered through it. I didn't wait to see what it would do at the ladder. I leaned back into the harness, lifted my boots clear of the wood, and let gravity take over. The pulley engaged with a metallic snap and the cable hummed. The tower dropped away behind me, the ravine opened up as a massive void under my boots, and the far side rushed toward me as a dark, blurred wall of pine and rock. I kept one hand death-gripped on the lanyard and the other wrapped around a short length of accessory cord clipped to the pulley frame. That cord was my brake. Pull too hard and the friction would burn right through my glove or shock-load the system. Do nothing and I risked slamming into the far tower at breaking speed. The cable sagged in the middle, a natural catenary curve where the speed would flatten out. As I approached that dip, the wind roaring in my ears, I hauled down on the brake cord. I didn't go for a full lock, just enough friction to start bleeding the momentum. The pulley groaned, a high-pitched protest of metal on metal, and heat built instantly under my leather palm. For a few seconds, nothing changed. Then the rush of air eased, and the far tower stopped charging at me. I let off the pressure a little, felt the pulley roll smooth again, then set the brake once more, shorter and harder. The second squeeze slowed me to a crawl. I drifted to a stop, hanging maybe 15 meters past the midpoint of the span, far enough from both towers that any jump from either side would fall tragically short, plunging deep into open air. I forced myself to breathe, slow, measured breaths, in through the nose, out through the mouth. Check what matters. Pulley seated on the cable? Yes. Lanyard locked? Yes. Backup carabiner closed? Yes. Harness centered? Yes. The far tower stood empty. When I twisted my neck to look back, I could just see the top of the launch platform I had fled. A pale shape paced at the edge. It hadn't tried to climb the cable or call out. It simply stood above the drop, watching. It was patient. That was almost worse than the speed. Hanging there between them, suspended over 100 meters of nothing, I understood something basic. The ground was theirs now. Anything that still used dirt for a floor was vulnerable. This cable was different. No stairs, no ladders, no handholds. Just air and steel and whatever I could hang off it. My shoulders already ached from the braking force, and the harness leg loops were cutting off circulation to my thighs. I wasn't going to hold this position long by muscle alone. If this was going to be more than a one-way ride, I needed a way to stay here that didn't depend on grip strength and dumb luck. The only shelter I had was the cliff tent in my pack, a portaledge system I used on big wall routes when there was no flat ground to sleep on. I had thrown it in the truck more out of habit than any real plan. Now it was the only thing that could turn this steel cable into a place I could survive for more than an hour. I clipped a short safety runner from my belay loop directly to the cable with a spare steel carabiner, just in case the pulley failed while I was working, then wrestled the pack around to my front. For a moment it hung off one shoulder and my center of balance shifted violently. I swung in the wind, staring down at the treetops far below. I took a breath, got both straps on my chest and let the load sit heavily against the harness. I opened the top lid, felt for the bulk of the folded tent and dragged it out onto my thighs. This was the dangerous part. Everything had to stay clipped or tied. If I dropped the tent, this line went back to being a cold place to die. The frame was built to hang from a single master point. The zipline cable was a solid anchor as long as the towers stayed standing. I snapped a heavy locking carabiner around the main cable, tied a short loop of static cord between that carabiner and the tent's suspension straps, and pulled the metal frame open. The hinges fought my numb hands. The aluminum bars twisted once, jamming against the fabric before finally locking into place with a satisfying click. When the frame finally sat open and the fabric platform hung level, I lowered it carefully until it sat just below my hips, suspended from the cable by its own suspension system. Then came the transfer. I lowered myself into it, moving slow. The rig swung once in a slow, sickening arc, then settled. The load shifted off my harness and into the tent straps. The cable above hummed under the new weight distribution, but it held. I stayed clipped into the pulley in my backup, sitting low with my center of gravity close to the fabric. Only when I was absolutely sure nothing was slipping did I start to clean up the mess of gear. The pack came off my chest and I set it beside me on the platform, immediately clipping it in with its own leash. The cold hit harder now that I was still. The adrenaline was fading, leaving me shivering. The tent came with a fabric fly, a wall kit, thin nylon but better than nothing. I dug it out of the stuff sack and worked the zippers and buckles with stiff, clumsy fingers, closing off as much wind as I could. The view of the ravine dimmed as the panels went up, enclosing me, until the open sky was just a narrow stripe over the cable. Inside that smaller space, the sound of the wind dropped to a dull murmur. It felt like a cocoon. I unstrapped the compact gas heater and the single metal bottle from the side of the pack, set them near the center of the platform, and checked the valve. No dents in the cylinder, no obvious damage from the scramble. Heat inside a closed fabric box can kill you as fast as the cold if you use up all the oxygen. I cracked one corner of the fly to make a small vent, then opened the valve a fraction and hit the piezo igniter. The heater coughed once, sputtered, and then a low blue ring of flame took hold. Warmth started to gather in the small space. I held my hands over the grid and watched the skin go from waxy and numb to a flushed red. Fingers tingled and then burned as the feeling crept back into the nerves. The platform moved in a slow, gentle swing, rocking in the wind. For the first time since I saw that thing in the lot, I wasn't running. I wasn't fighting for footing on ice. And most importantly, I wasn't standing on their ground. I was floating, and for tonight that had to be enough. The compact heater threw off a slow, steady warmth. It wasn't much, barely a candle against the mountain night, but it took the razor edge off the air long enough for my hands to finally stop shaking. My breath still smoked under the canvas fly, and the nylon walls flexed and snapped when gusts hit the cable outside, but the fabric held. For now, the world was just this small, suspended box. I checked my phone again out of habit. Still dead. No signal this deep in the ravine. The rock walls swallowed the cell towers whole. The signal bar stayed empty, mocking me. That left the small emergency radio in the lid pocket of my pack. The cheap, battery-operated kind people take on camping trips for weather alerts. I pulled it out, flipped the telescoping antenna up, and thumbed the power wheel. Static filled the tent first. A wash of white noise. I turned the tuning dial slow, stepping through thin bands of hiss and pop until a voice finally cut through in short, broken bursts. It was a male news anchor trying desperately to sound calm on a station I knew from town. His voice chopped in and out as the AM signal bounced off the terrain. He was talking about a rapid onset condition spreading through major metropolitan areas. Then he corrected himself, his voice tightening, and said, through most major regions. The details were fragmented but clear enough. Hospitals overwhelmed within hours. Emergency rooms locked down. Staff walking off the job or barricading themselves inside. Officials were on a loop, telling people to stay inside, lock their doors, and avoid contact with anyone showing abnormal strength or aggression. That phrase sat heavy in my head. Abnormal strength and aggression. I closed my eyes and could see that pale shape in the parking lot again, hitting the ice at a full sprint without slipping once. That wasn't aggression. That was predation. The anchor's tone cracked when he read a new note handed to him from the desk. There were confirmed reports, he said, of people who did not respond to pain compliance, who kept moving with broken limbs, who attacked by biting and tearing. Police were unable to contain multiple ongoing incidents. Military units were en route to assist. Stock phrases. Empty words from people who still wanted listeners to believe that someone somewhere had control of the situation. The station cut to another voice, a field reporter calling in from farther east. More of the same, only worse. Callers were talking over each other on the line, screaming about relatives who had gone down in the street, apparently dead, then stood up again and gone after whoever was closest. One woman swore her neighbor had been shot 3 times and still climbed across the hood of a moving car to get at the driver. I killed the volume, spinning the dial down until it was just a murmur, and listened to the tent instead. The main cable hummed a low note when the wind shifted. The fabric creaked against the aluminum frame. The gas whispered through the heater jets. When I turned the dial higher again, moving away from news and music, the emergency bands bled through the static. This was the raw feed. Dispatchers fighting to keep order on channels that were dissolving into chaos. Units called for backup and got silence. A medic begged for a clear route out of a subdivision and was told flatly that there were no cars left to send. Higher still, a ham radio operator with a strong signal was reading out a list of cities where, in his words, "It is not safe to be on the ground after dark." The list went on long enough that I stopped counting. Nobody used the word zombie. They said infected subjects, persons of interest, rioters. Different labels for the same nightmare shape. People, or what used to be people, running others down, ignoring pain, ignoring gunfire, ignoring everything except the movement of living things within reach. From the tent, through the small vent, I could see one strip of indigo sky and a bite of the far ridge line. Everything below that line dropped out of view into the black. I knew enough about what was down there. A road full of dead vehicles. Pale bodies like the one at the tower, moving through the parking lots and side streets, drawn to noise and motion like moths to a flame. Trapped wasn't quite the right word. I ran a mental inventory. I had 2 liters of water, some food, bars, jerky, a little dried fruit, 1 gas bottle, and a tent hanging from a steel cable that did not touch the ground. The problem wasn't immediate safety. The problem was the clock. Food and fuel run out. Batteries die, hydration fails. Sooner or later, I would need more than what was in the pack. The tent gave me something I hadn't had since I left the summit hours ago, room to think without walking. I shut off the radio to save the batteries and slid it back into the pocket. The heat from the burner gathered around my legs, a fleeting comfort. On the ground, anything living had become prey. Those things were stronger and faster than us, and they didn't seem to care when their bones broke. You could stack furniture against a door and weld bars over the windows, but if they could hit a wall all night without stopping, every fortification was just a timer counting down. Up here, the math shifted. They couldn't jump this far. They couldn't climb a bare steel tower with no rungs. They couldn't run across a tensioned cable. The only weak points were the hardware and my own planning. I checked the gas level with a quick tilt of the canister. It felt about half full. I did a rough calculation in my head and shut the valve. Darkness crept back instantly as the blue glow faded, bringing the cold with it. I pulled my sleeping bag higher around my chest and lay still on the fabric bed, feeling each small sway as the cable flexed in the wind. This wasn't a full plan. It was a pause, a slice of space where the ground and the things that owned it couldn't reach me. That made it worth holding on to for as long as I could. Sometime after the radio chatter faded into static, the quality of the light outside shifted. The fabric roof over my head went flat and gray, the specific drained look it gets when the sun drops behind the ridge but hasn't fully committed to night. My best guess put it at late afternoon, that critical twilight window where you either make a move or accept you're staying put until morning. The cable hummed once. My body tensed before my brain even caught up. Wind can do that. A heavy gust hitting the span broadside and sending a low-frequency vibration through the steel. But this felt different. It was shorter, sharper. It felt like someone had struck the line near one of the anchor points. I unzipped the nearest panel just a hand's width and peered out. The trees on the far side of the ravine were moving in the wind, branches thrashing. The upper tower stood empty against the gray sky. The parking lot and the road on the near side were hidden from this angle, blocked by the density of the pine canopy and the bulk of the tower itself. The second jolt came half a minute later. The tent shifted on its suspension cords and the cable rang once, a high metallic note that faded fast. That wasn't wind, that was weight, live load. I moved fast. I clipped my adjustable lanyard into the pulley and a backup point on the frame, checked both carabiners by feel to ensure the gates were locked, then opened the panel wider. I hauled myself up high enough to see over the edge of the tent and look back at the tower. The launch platform came into view first. No pale heads at the rail, no bodies sprawled on the stairs. Then something moved lower down. A figure stepped out onto the concrete pad at the base of the tower. It was small at this distance, but clearly human and definitely not moving like the things I had seen in the lot. The stride was uneven, careful, almost hesitant. Bright fabric flashed under a darker shell, orange or red, the kind of high-visibility color search and rescue teams wear so a helicopter can spot them in the timber. The person craned their neck back and looked up the tower structure. I saw a harness on their hips, straps over their shoulders, and a pack on their back. They walked to the base of the ladder, put a hand on the first rung, hesitated for a long beat, and then started up. I should have yelled right then. I should have told them to turn around, run back to the woods, and find a different hole to hide in. Instead, I watched. I counted each pause and restart, trying to read their movement, looking for the long, jerky mechanical steps that marked the infected. They climbed like someone who knew exactly what a fall from that height would do to a human body. 3 rungs, stop, listen. 3 more, pause to check the handhold. Whoever they were, they still cared about staying alive. They weren't mindless, they were terrified. By the time they reached the top deck, my throat had gone dry. They stepped through the safety gate and walked to the cable, putting both hands on the guardrail. Their eyes tracked the line out over the ravine, likely spotting my tent as a strange silhouette against the sky. From my angle, all I could see clearly was their side profile. It looked female, but winter layers lie about size and shape, so I just filed it as someone small but still moving with purpose. She looked back toward the lot one last time. Even from 100 meters away, I could tell she didn't like what she saw. Her shoulders hunched up, her head dipped for a second like she was fighting back vomit or tears, and then she squared up again. She unclipped something from her harness gear loop. The park's commercial trolley still hung on its safety chain off to one side, heavy and locked. Nobody was touching that. Instead, she pulled out a small pulley, the kind climbers use for hauling gear bags, not people, and a short sling of nylon webbing. My stomach turned over. That was a setup that might roll on a clean horizontal cable for a short hop. It was not designed for a high-tension zipline span over a deep hole. The bearings were too small, the sheave was too narrow, and the friction would be a nightmare. She hooked the sling through the pulley, clipped the whole makeshift rig to her belay loop, and tested it with a slight sit. The cable dipped under her weight, then sprang back. From here, it looked like a desperate bad idea balanced on top of the only idea she had left. I finally found my voice. The wind and distance ate most of it, but I tried anyway. I cupped my hands and shouted that she needed to stop, that the rig she had would bind or slip. She turned her head, squinted along the line, and for a second I thought she had seen me or heard the warning. If she heard me, it didn't change her math. She swung one leg over the rail, then the other until she hung from the pulley with her boots clear of the platform. The move was controlled. No wild kicks, no panic flailing. She was scared. I could see the tension in her neck, but she still knew how to sit in a harness. For a heartbeat, she just hung there, knuckles white on the sling, staring down at the drop. Then she shifted her weight, let the pulley take the full load, and started to move. From where I sat, the first stretch looked almost calm. The pulley rolled, the sling held, and the cable sagged just enough to smooth the line. Her body hung steady, legs slightly bent, arms braced. Then physics took over. Once she crossed the shallow high point near the tower, gravity gave her more speed than that tiny pulley wanted. It began to chatter on the cable. Small, rapid hops that turned into hard skips. I heard a faint metallic clatter, clack, 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 echoing across the gap. Then the whole rig jerked violently. She swung sideways, hit the air hard, and the pulley jammed crooked on the cable. Her body whipped once like a pendulum and then stopped dead. Her left arm wrenched high and her right hand clamped over the webbing to keep from spinning. She was stuck, maybe 20 meters closer to the far side than me, hanging over the deepest, darkest part of the ravine with nothing under her but jagged rock and open air. The cable took both our weights now and hummed a low, unhappy note. The tent swayed in a wider, sickening arc. On the tower, something else moved. Two pale shapes stepped into view at the edge of the deck, drawn by the sound of her launch or my shout. They walked to the rail with that same smooth, fast, predatory gait. They didn't pause at the gate. They stopped short of the drop and fixed their eyes on the body hanging from the line. They couldn't reach her. They couldn't jump that gap. But they paced the rail anyway, fingers twitching on the metal, heads tilting in short, sharp motions like birds of prey tracking a mouse. They were testing the distance, calculating. She looked back over one shoulder, saw them, and I watched the realization hit her. The line might as well have been a few meters above their heads instead of tens. One rigging mistake, one failed grip, one piece of nylon snapping, and she wouldn't have time to scream before they were on her. My world shrank to 3 points. The tent and the hardware keeping it on the cable. The woman hanging ahead of me in a bad improvised harness, suspended by a thread. And the infected gathering on the tower, too far to touch us but close enough to wait for gravity to do their work for them. The only way this scenario ended with both of us alive was if she stopped hanging off that piece of garbage hardware and started hanging off my rated gear. Watching her freeze up or waiting for her cheap pulley to shear off the bearing and drop her into the dark was not an option I was willing to entertain. I moved methodically. I clipped my adjustable chest tether into the main pulley, backed it up with a second locking carabiner through my belay loop, and ran one final tactile check over every gate. Click-locked, click-locked. If something failed out there over the gap, I wanted more than one piece of aluminum between me and the rocks 100 meters down. When it all felt as solid as it was ever going to get, I braced my boots against the aluminum frame of the tent, took a deep, steadying breath, and pushed off. The tent swung away behind me and the pulley started to roll. A low vibration traveled up through the lanyard and into my shoulders, the hum of steel on steel. I kept one hand wrapped tight on the brake cord, not chasing speed, just keeping us moving at a controlled crawl. And the dark box of the shelter slid out of sight. She hung ahead of me, still jammed tight on the cable, gripping the twisted sling with both hands like it was a lifeline. Every small gust of wind made her whole rig twitch violently. The distance closed slowly, then all at once. First, she was just a knot on the line, a silhouette against the gray sky, and then I was close enough to see the frost crystals on her hood and the cracked, dry skin at the corners of her mouth. Her eyes were wide, tracking me with a mix of hope and terror. I eased down on the brake until I was almost perfectly level with her, then set it hard enough that the pulley groaned and locked. We hung side by side over the drop, two small shapes in a massive void. Up close, her setup was even worse than it had looked through the binoculars. The tiny haul pulley sat crooked on the cable, the bearings likely crushed, and the nylon sling was twisted tight against the metal cheek plate. Any hard bounce now, or a sudden shock load, and the webbing would either shear clean or spit her off into the ravine. She looked at my heavy-duty rig, then up at my face and said, "If you've got a plan, say it fast, because I can't feel my hands anymore." I kept my voice flat and calm and answered, "I'm going to clip you directly into my system, take your full weight, and then strip that mess off the cable. You don't let go of your sling until I say I have you, and then you move slow." She drew one short, ragged breath, nodded once, and said, "Copy that. Junia Ashford, by the way, just in case this goes bad and somebody finds what's left of us down there." I reached across the gap, fighting the swing. I clipped a spare dynamic lanyard from my harness into the main tie-in points on her harness, locked the gate with a definitive snap, then added a second connection, a heavy steel locker, from her belay loop to the main carabiner sitting under my pulley. The links took up the slack and the cable shifted under us, settling into a new, deeper sag. I checked the gates one more time and told her, "All right, you're on 2 solid points here. I'm going to stand up in my loops and pick up more of the load to off-weight your gear. When I say now, you try to unweight that sling just enough for me to clear it from the cable." She closed her eyes for a second, opened them, focused on my chest, and said, "Say when." Pressure built around my waist as I pushed down hard into my leg loops, straining against gravity until my thighs shook with the effort. I felt the cable groan. When I felt the pull come fully into my harness and saw her shoulders dip slightly, I gritted my teeth and said, "Now, just lift a hair." Her arms trembled violently, but she managed to pull her body up an inch. The tension released on her sling. I grabbed the twisted webbing, wrenched it back the other way, and shoved the small wheel straight. It popped into line with a crack, rolled an inch, and I didn't give it time to bind again. With her still holding as much of her own weight as she could muster, I popped the carabiner on the sling and kicked the empty, useless pulley away from the cable. For a moment, she hung completely on my gear. The harness bit deep into my hips and ribs, cutting off circulation. The cable buzzed angrily under the combined weight of 2 people in gear, vibrating like a plucked instrument string, then finally eased into a new, heavy balance. She let out a long, shuddering breath and said, "That felt a lot worse than it probably looked." I adjusted my grip on the brake and said, "It looked bad enough from here." Then I shifted my hand to her shoulder strap to stabilize her and added, "We're going back to the tent. Don't fight the ride. If you start to swing, just pull your knees in and let it settle." She gave a short, sharp nod. I eased off the brake cord and let the pulley roll. Under the extra load, the return trip was slower. The wheel ground against the cable. She hung close, one shoulder pressed against my chest, boots dangling over the abyss, and the wind ate most of the other sounds. When the tent finally came into view, a dark, suspended box on the line, something tight in my chest finally loosened. I reached out as we slid alongside, caught a structural strap on the frame and pulled us in until my hip hit the fabric wall. Getting her into the tent without spinning us both into a tangled mess took a few careful, choreographed moves. I clipped a short, adjustable tether from her harness directly to a rigging ring on the frame, then unhooked one of her lanyards from my system so she could pivot her body. Within a minute, we were both sitting inside on the fabric bed, backs against opposite sides of the small space, still tied into at least one hard point each. The heater sat between us, a cold lump of metal waiting for fuel. Outside, the ravine slipped out of view again as the tent drifted back toward the midpoint of the span. She peeled her gloves off with her teeth and flexed her stiff white fingers, then looked at me properly for the first time. Her dark hair was cut short and practical under the hood, and a streak of dried brown and red fluid marked one side of her jacket. I nodded at the stain and said, "Before we do anything else, I need to know if any of that is yours, and if anything on you is bitten, broken, or cut." She followed my gaze, unzipped her shell a hand's width to check the layers underneath, and answered, "Not mine. A guy at the base tried to grab my pack when I was climbing. One of those things hit him before I decided if I was going to help. I was close enough to get sprayed. No bite, no scratch, nothing went through the fabric." Her hands moved frantically with the words, checking cuffs and seams, verifying her own skin. I asked, "Any dislocations from that hang? Shoulder, hip, anything feel out of place?" She rolled her left shoulder slowly, winced as the joint popped, and said, "It's angry but not out. Hips are bruised from the harness. Everything still moves when I tell it to." That fit what I had seen on the line. I let some of the tension bleed out of my neck and shoulders and said, "All right, I'm Harlan. This tent and what's in that pack is the whole world for now." She looked around the cramped, swaying space, took in the clipped gear, the single gas bottle, the narrow fabric bed, met my eyes again and said, "Then thanks for letting me into your whole world, Harlan. I was running out of places to hang." We sat there for a minute with nothing but the wind and the groan of the cable between us. The tent swung once in a wide arc and then settled, and watching her rub life back into her frozen fingers made it clear we needed more than names if we were going to share this platform without getting each other killed. I reached for the gas bottle, checked the valve, and said, "I'm going to light this for a few minutes so we can both think straight, but we can't burn through it like we're on a weekend camping trip." And she nodded, pulled the vent flap open a hand's width to let the carbon monoxide out, and answered, "Short bursts only, I get it." The burner caught on the second click, and a low ring of blue flame built between us, pushing back the dark. I looked at her and said, "All right, Junia. You know my name, and you've seen my bad idea hanging on a cable. How do you end up at that tower with a SAR harness and a haul pulley instead of a car in a driveway?" She warmed her hands over the flame for a few seconds, then looked up and said, "County Search and Rescue. I was on shift when the first weird calls started rolling in. People attacking family members, hikers turning on their partners, drivers aiming for other cars on purpose. It all sounded like a bad batch of drugs until it didn't." She stared at the heater's glow and added, "The first scene we hit was a scenic pullout. 2 cars, 4 bodies moving. 1 was already dead. 3 were trying hard to make it 4. Deputies went hands-on, tasers first, then guns. Chest shots dropped people and they still got back up. Command finally stopped lying and told us on a closed channel that some of the patients were self-resuscitating after fatal injuries." I asked, "So after that, you just bugged out?" She shook her head and answered, "We tried to pretend it was still our job. Shuttled a few families, tried to move them toward town, but calls stacked up, units stopped checking in. And dispatch kept repeating that stay inside line while people screamed over them. Then one of our own got scratched, breaking up a fight, and went bad overnight. We had to put him down in the back of the truck. After that, we stopped putting anyone in the rig at all." She rubbed her face, wiping away exhaustion, and said, "They told us to regroup at the Valley Station. We came around the last bend and saw the bay doors open and those pale things swarming all over our own crew. We never even slowed down. The truck kept going. I bailed at the turnoff and went up the mountain instead of down." I said, "Up to the ski area," and she nodded and answered, "Ooh, high ground, fewer people, cold might help slow them down. Lifts were dead, lodge was chained from the inside, no lights. I spent one night in a patrol shack with a busted radio and a half tank of fuel and decided I wasn't going to wait there to get cornered." I asked, "How long have you been moving since then?" She blew out a slow breath and answered, 3 days, maybe 4. I stayed on ridges and service roads, kept my elevation, slept in short shifts. I've seen them up close and that was enough. Stronger than they should be, faster than we are." Her eyes went to the gas bottle between us and then back to mine, and she said, "When I saw the park from a cut in the trees, it looked like a lifeline. Cable over a drop, towers I know. I watched for hours, saw one of them run a guy down at the gate, never saw anyone shoot back from the lodge. That told me it was either empty or already lost." She gave a small, tired half smile and added, "Then I saw you on the line, a tiny shape in the air. By the time I got to the tower, you were just a lump way out there, and the platform felt like bad ground. The pulley was wrong, I knew that, but staying on concrete with those things sniffing around felt worse. I said, 'You were right about getting off the slab and wrong about the metal.' And she answered, 'Story of my week,' then let out a short laugh that died fast. I pulled the food bag into my lap, unzipped it, and spread everything out between us. Half a loaf of bread, 2 small bags of trail mix, 3 energy bars, a handful of jerky, 1 freeze-dried meal I'd planned to use on a ledge, not here. I said, 'This is enough for 1 person for maybe 2 days. If I stretch it and don't have to sprint, it is not enough for 2 people for long.' She nodded at the pile and asked, 'Water?' So I pointed at the 2-liter bottles clipped to the frame and answered, 'Almost full, both of them, and we have snow if we burn gas to melt it.' Her gaze dropped to the single cylinder by the heater and she said, "1 bottle." I answered, "1 bottle. Good for short burns like this for a couple of days if we're careful. Not good enough to pretend this is a cabin." She leaned her head back against the fabric wall, closed her eyes for a beat, then opened them and said, "So even if those things can't reach us, hunger and cold still can." And I answered, "Yeah. This isn't a fix, it's a pause." And finally I said, "Kutu, tomorrow when it's full light, I'm going to have to go down. We need more fuel and more food, and the only place close that might have both is that lodge and the maintenance sheds around it." She frowned, thought for a second, and said, "If you go, I stay. I can watch from here, track anything moving near the base, keep a radio on you if those still work." I asked, "You trust me enough to walk toward the only real threat you've seen while you sit in the only safe spot you found?" She gave a small shrug and answered, "Right now, my choices are trust the guy who dragged me off bad gear, or jump and find out how hard the bottom is. I'll gamble on you." I split the food into 2 rough piles, one for what was left of this day, and one for whatever came after I touched the ground again. I sealed the bag and clipped it back to the frame so it could move with the tent instead of sliding into the dark. Junia pushed herself up to a sitting position, rolled her injured shoulder once to test the joint, and said, "You still going down there?" I answered, "Yeah. Food we can stretch a bit, gas we can't. If we want this tent to stay a safe place and not a freezer, we need more fuel and something heavy to eat." She checked her harness buckles and the wire running to her radio earbud and said, "Then you go light, you move fast, and you don't go exploring. In grab out. No side trips." I nodded because that was the only way this worked. We stripped the gear list down to the essentials: harness, main lanyard, pulley for the cable. For the ground, I took a small summit pack, an empty water bladder, a headlamp, and a short steel pry bar. No spare rope, no extra metal to clank against rocks. For defense, I stayed with a fixed blade knife on my chest rig and a hammer on my belt loop. I didn't have a gun, and from what I'd seen, those pale things were too fast to treat this like target practice anyway. We split the radios. I clipped one to my shoulder strap, ran the wire under my jacket to keep it from freezing, and said, "If you see movement near the base, you key twice and say, 'Freeze.' If you lose sight of me for more than a minute, you call once and I answer. If I don't answer, you don't come down." She slid the other unit into an inside pocket and answered, "Copy. Same rule for me. If I drop off the line, you don't come looking." I walked us through the route one last time. Off the cable to the top deck, down the tower ladder, cut into the tree line, and go straight to the lodge wall that faces the woods, I said. "I'll skip the main glass doors. I'll use a side or service door, hit the dry storage pantry, take 1 propane bottle and as much dense food as I can carry, and come back the same way." She listened, eyes focused, then said, "Stay behind steel and wood when you can. Trucks, berms, retaining walls. They chase movement and sound. If something breaks and makes noise, you move immediately." I pulled my gloves on, checked each carabiner by touch, and said, "If I don't answer the radio, this gear is yours and I'm gone. You don't come looking." She met my eyes and answered, "Deal. You're not my last job. I'm not yours." I clipped into the pulley, tied the backup loop around the cable, and slid out through the tent panel. The cold hit hard. The ravine below was a white bowl shadowed by dark rock and trees on both sides. The ride toward the near tower took seconds. I eased the brake early, let the speed bleed off, and grabbed the wooden rail when the platform filled my view. I stayed clipped in while I crossed to the stairs, shifted my tether to the structure, and went down in short bursts, stopping once to listen. At the base, the concrete pad was empty. I stepped off the slab and into the trees instead of the open lane. From there, I could see a slice of the parking lot and the long side of the lodge. A pale body lay near a sedan, twisted on the ice. It didn't move while I watched. No heads rose between the vehicles. No shapes lingered at the doors. I thumbed the radio and said, "Tower and pad clear," moving along the trees toward the lodge wall. After a second of static, she answered, "Copy. I've got eyes on the building." Lot looks quiet. The snow under the trees was crusted and uneven. I kept the thick trunks between me and the open ground, moving in short lines and only crossing bare spots when there was no choice. The glass front doors stayed out of my sight on purpose. Halfway down the side wall, a narrow metal service door broke the siding. I headed for it, using a parked plow truck as cover until the last few meters. I tried the handle. It moved a little and then caught on a chain from the inside. I didn't start swinging the bar. I lifted on the handle gently, felt the chain ride up the gap, and shoved the pry bar in at the same time. The loop slipped off whatever anchor it was on. The door jumped and opened inward with a low scrape of metal on concrete. Inside smelled like cold grease and cardboard. I moved past the silent kitchen and straight into dry storage. The shelves there carried exactly what we needed. Canned food, bags of rice and oats, huge tubs of sugar and salt. I grabbed the heaviest, most compact calories I could reach. The pack filled in under a minute. I stopped loading before it crossed the line from heavy to stupid. 2 compression sacks took the extra cans. I tied them tight so the metal wouldn't rattle. On the way back out, I saw a utility closet with 2 blue propane cylinders strapped to a frame. Both gauges sat high, full. I unbuckled one, tested the weight, and decided that was as much as I could risk carrying up a ladder. 1 bottle now, 1 left for later if later ever came. I keyed the radio and whispered, "Got 1 bottle and a full pack, coming back the same way." She answered, "Copy. Your door's still quiet. Lot looks dead from up here." Outside again, I pulled the door closed until the latch caught, then cut back to the trees using the same plow truck for cover. At one point, I dropped to a knee, checked under a pickup for pale feet, and only crossed the gap when I saw nothing but asphalt. The tower came into view between the trunks. I didn't relax just because I could see it. I walked a slow circle around the base, checked the pad and the shadows for any ambush, then put both hands on the ladder and climbed. Halfway up, I stopped once more to listen. Nothing but wind in the pines. I kept going, my heart hitting harder from nerves than the effort. At the top deck, I clipped into the rail before I even stepped clear of the ladder. The cable waited at chest height. Far out over the ravine, the tent sat on the line like a small dark knot against the sky. Junia's voice came in soft and clear over the earpiece, and she said, "I've got you on the deck. No movement below. You're clear to ride." I hooked the pulley over the cable, clipped my lanyard in, tied the backup around the steel, and hauled the heavy propane bottle up so it hung low under my arm, centered. Then I stepped onto the rail, swung out into empty air again, and let the line carry us both back toward the only shelter we had. I reached the tent, grabbed the aluminum frame with one hand to stabilize, then eased the brake and let the pulley grind to a halt. The cable hummed once under the shift in tension and then went still. When I had my balance, I clipped my short safety tether to the main line and said into the radio, "I'm locked in, coming inside." And Junia answered immediately, "Got you. I'll clear the space." Inside, she had already pushed the heater to the center and moved her pack to the far corner to make room. I hauled the heavy propane cylinder in first, wrestled it onto the fabric floor, and immediately clipped it to a webbing loop so it couldn't roll. Then I dragged my body through the panel, zipped it shut behind me, and felt the air change from open, biting wind to the still cold atmosphere of the box again. She looked at the blue bottle and said, "That looks heavier than it should be from up here." And I set my pack down, flexed my cramped fingers, and answered, "Heavy enough." One more like that and I would have slowed down too much on the ascent. We leave the second one for when we really need it. I opened the pack between us and laid out the haul. Cans of calorie-dense stew, a bag of rice, a plastic jar of peanut butter, and a handful of sealed energy bars from a vending machine. It wasn't much by old standards, but it was a fortune by the new ones. The smell of the peanut butter hit the air first, and I heard both our stomachs react to the scent. Junia tore her eyes away from the food long enough to check my face and asked, "Any company down there?" I shook my head and answered, "Nothing moving near the lodge, just one body in the lot that didn't twitch. Either dead for real or not interested in anything it couldn't see." She nodded once, processing the intel, and said, "You were gone 12 minutes. I would have called you at 15. I wiped the frost from my eyebrows and answered, "Next time, call me at 10. It only gets worse after that." We split the food into small, rationed piles and agreed that nothing got opened unless we both said yes. Anything that made a strong smell like the stew waited for days when the wind was loud enough to mask us and the cable shook on its own. The new propane cylinder threaded onto the heater with a solid, reassuring click. I cracked the valve, listened for the hiss of a leak, then lit it. The warmth came up faster and stronger with a full tank feeding the burner. I looked at her and said, "All right, we have more gas, more food, and one more person than I planned for. We need rules, or this turns into a bad situation fast." She pulled her knees up to her chest to conserve heat and answered, "Start with the easy ones." I pointed up at the cable running through the roof of the fly and said, "Rule 1. If something sounds wrong in the hardware, we both stop and check it. I do main anchor checks every morning and whenever the wind changes. You double-check me when you can." She watched the way the steel line disappeared through the fabric panel and said, "Rule 2. We never both go down at the same time. One person on the ground, one in the tent. If the one on the ground disappears, the one up here does not go looking." "That works," I said. "Rule 3. Nothing on the floor stays loose. Every piece of gear is clipped, tied, or leashed. If this tent ever flips in a storm or we have to move in the dark, we don't want metal rolling out into space." She clipped a loose glove to a gear loop on the wall and added, "Rule 4. We keep radio talk short and plain. Brevity code. If I say stop, you stop. If you say climb, I climb. No debates while somebody is moving," and we added a few more and kept them simple. No open fire on the wooden towers. No yelling unless the other person cannot see the threat. No light leaks at night that could mark the tent as a target for anyone or anything watching from below. When the heater had run long enough to take the bite out of the air, I shut it off to save fuel. The temperature dipped immediately but stayed bearable. We ate a small amount, just enough for clear thinking rather than comfort, and drank water by slow, disciplined sips. After a while, Junia stared at the curve of the fabric over her head and said, "They are not like the movies." And I asked, "Which part?" She answered, "All of it. No slow shuffle, no groaning, just speed and power and no fear of impact." I watched one of them hit a guardrail hard enough to break its leg, and it kept dragging itself along like the bones were nothing. I thought of the thing in the parking lot and the one at the base of the tower, the way it hammered up the trail. I said, "I saw one take a patch of ice at a full sprint without slipping. Whatever this is, it doesn't care about self-preservation. It doesn't care about the meat it's wearing. It just cares that we move." She rubbed her thumb along a seam on her pants, staring at nothing, and said, "If they are that strong and that fast, walls and doors are just timers. People who stay on the ground are just waiting to find out how long their materials last." "So we stay off the ground," I said. "Cable, towers, anything that doesn't touch dirt. This tent becomes base, not home. We sleep here, we eat here, we plan here. We touch ground only when we have a clear target and a clear way back up." She looked at me across the small space, her face shadowed, and said, "And if the towers go? If the bolts fail?" I answered, "Then we run what is left of the cable to something new or we walk the ridges. But until that happens, this stays ours." The light outside shifted again, dropping toward true evening. One more cycle done. We checked the gear one more time, each of us putting hands on buckles and straps the other had already passed, verifying the safety systems. We cleared a little more room in the cramped tent and adjusted the way our sleeping bags overlapped so we could both lie down without fighting for fabric. Junia pulled her hood up, lay back on the nylon bed, and said, "This is still the strangest bivvy I've ever had." I checked the valve on the heater one last time and answered, "Same here. But right now I think we might be the only people in this valley who can try to sleep without a wall giving out on us." She smiled once, quick and tired, and said, "Then let's not waste it," and rolled onto her side with the radio resting near her hand. I stayed awake a little longer, listening to the small sounds of the tent and the distant hollow wind in the ravine. The ground below was theirs now, full of things too fast to fight and too strong to hide from for long. But the cable above held steady, the anchors were solid, and for this first day at least we had a base in the air and a plan to keep using it. If you enjoyed the story, please like, subscribe, and comment where you're listening from. See you in the next one.